Hello, and welcome to the 65th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's pod is titled Biogas, Biomethane, and Europe's Search for Energy Security. Europe has been handed another extreme reminder that imported gas is more than just a commodity. It is a geopolitical exposure with a price tag attached. The war in Iran has ripped through LNG markets, pushed benchmark European gas prices sharply higher, up some 70% at its peak price. That shock has dragged energy security back to the front of the policy table once again. And that is the deeper problem here. Europe keeps treating gas shocks as episodes when they are really features of an import-dependent system. So, today we are asking a plain question. How much of this vulnerability could Europe shave off with a serious biogas and biomethane build-out? And how quickly? Before we go any further, we need to tidy up the language, because half the debate trips over the terminology. When people say biogas, they often mean two different things. First, there is raw biogas, produced by anaerobic digestion of manure, food waste, sewage sludge, crop residues, and other organic feedstocks. That gas is usually burned on site for electricity and heat, or cleaned up for local use. Then there is biomethane, sometimes called renewable natural gas, which is upgraded to a gas quality that can go into pipelines, industrial burners, boilers, trucks, and in some cases shipping. If the question is whether Europe can partially replace imported natural gas, biomethane is where the commercial conversation gets serious. Europe needs more usable molecules that can go through existing infrastructure, reach real off-takers, and reduce exposure to volatile global LNG markets without waiting for a 10-year infrastructure sermon. Biomethane has that advantage. It is dispatchable, storable, and compatible with large parts of the gas system Europe already has. That makes it practical, which in energy policy is often the rarer achievement. So, where does Europe stand now? Better than many people think, and still far behind, where the politics keeps pretending it wants to go. Europe produced roughly 22 billion cubic meters of combined biogas and biomethane in 2024, with about 19 billion cubic meters, known as BCM, of that in the EU 27. Biomethane alone reached about 5.2 billion cubic meters across Europe, with 4.3 billion cubic meters in the EU 27. There are now more than 21,000 biogas and biomethane plants across Europe, including more than 1,600 biomethane plants, and installed biomethane capacity had already reached about 7 billion cubic meters per year by the first quarter of 2025. Those are not hobby numbers anymore. That is an industrial platform. Still, let us keep our feet on the floor. That 22 billion cubic meters of combined output represented only around 6% of EU natural gas consumption in 2024. Useful, yes. Transformative, no. The EU still imported 85.6% of the natural gas it used in 2024. That figure was a European Achilles heel amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, the supply chain shock from the Iran war landed so hard precisely because the bloc remained structurally exposed to imported molecules, imported price formation, and imported panic. When a few shipping lanes wobble, Europe's energy bill starts behaving like a nervous cat in a room full of rocking chairs. France, Germany, Italy, and Denmark are the main EU biomethane producers, and the UK remains an important non-EU reference point. France has now moved into the lead in biomethane growth and market scale-up. Germany still dominates the broader biogas system because it built early and built big, often around power generation. Italy has been aggressive in shifting toward injected biomethane and transport use. Denmark remains the one that makes the rest of Europe look as if it should maybe spend less time writing strategy papers and more time laying pipes and signing contracts. Denmark has already shown that a very high share of green gas in the grid is feasible, and the International Energy Agency's latest outlook suggests biomethane could reach the equivalent of the entire Danish gas grid by 2030 if targets are met. France could get to around 15% of gas grid volumes on the same basis. Those are serious markers. Now let us get to the homes question, because this is where public debate loves a large round number. If you take current European combined biogas and biomethane output and translate the energy content into household heating equivalents, you get a number in the rough range of around 20 million average homes. If you look at biomethane alone, current European output is more like the equivalent of around 4 to 5 million homes. If Europe actually reached the 35 billion cubic meters target that Brussels keeps invoking for 2030, the energy content would be roughly equivalent to something like the gas use of 30 to 34 million average homes. That sounds huge, and it is. It is also where lazy storytelling begins. Because Europe should not take a finite pool of renewable gas and spread it thinly across every domestic boiler it can find. That would be politically seductive and strategically mediocre. The higher value uses sit elsewhere: industrial heat that cannot yet be electrified economically, dispatchable power and combined heat and power, heavy transport, shipping through bio-LNG, even hybrid heating in tougher building stock. This is a partial list of flexible use where every cubic meter displaces imported fossil gas at the highest system value. Biomethane works best when used like a scarce strategic fuel, not a comfort blanket. That is also where the UK figures need some adult supervision. The oft-heard claim that around 1 million homes are already covered by UK biomethane capacity is broadly grounded in current industry evidence. The higher claim that coherent policy could stretch the same system toward 5 million homes has a narrower meaning. That figure is tied to hybrid heating systems, where a heat pump handles most of the annual load, and biomethane covers the colder peaks and backup function. In other words, 5 million hybrid heated homes is not the same thing as 5 million homes fully heated by straight biomethane all year round. The distinction is important. One is plausible within a hybrid system architecture. The other is far more stretched. Numbers in energy policy tend to behave better when they are not forced into fancy dress. So yes, there is truth in the UK story, with caveats attached. Current British biomethane capacity appears to sit around the equivalent of roughly 1 million homes. Current actual output may be somewhat lower in direct use terms. A hybrid-based expansion can multiply the number of homes touched by the fuel. That is a system design argument, not a fuel volume miracle. And Europe should pay attention to it, because hybridization is one of the few ways to cut gas demand without pretending the entire legacy building stock can be turned into Scandinavian new builds by next Tuesday. Now, how realistic is a European biogas development strategy as a substitute for imported natural gas? Realistic enough to matter. Limited enough to disappoint anyone expecting a silver bullet. That is the honest range. If Europe were serious, biomethane could become a meaningful shock absorber by 2030. The Commission's RE-Power EU framework points to 35 billion cubic metres by 2030. On paper, that is a little over a tenth of current EU gas demand. In practice, it would not replace a tenth of the problem evenly. It would do something smarter. It would replace imported gas in the sectors and regions where domestic renewable gas has the highest value, especially where agricultural residues, food waste, wastewater streams, and gas infrastructure already exist. It would also reduce the need to pay whatever ransom global LNG markets demand every time another geopolitical fault line cracks open. But the current trajectory still falls short. That is where Europe's political memory problem turns up again, as we discussed in last week's pod. Brussels announced ambition, markets responded, developers mobilised, investors leaned in. Then the hard bit arrived, permitting. Feedstock rules, grid access, certificate markets, demand guarantees, stable support frameworks. Of course, the hardest part is actual offtake. The usual European obstacle course, where every government loves domestic energy security right up to the point where it must standardise a contract, de-risk a connection, or stop changing the rules every 18 months. And this happens right across the EU, not just in Portugal. National commitments currently point to something more like 26 billion cubic metres of combined biogas and biomethane by 2030. That is progress. It is still below the RE-Power EU rhetoric. Some analysts suggest current biomethane trajectories leave Europe closer to the mid-teens by 2030, rather than the full 35 billion cubic metres. So the main risk here is not technical fantasy. It is political under-delivery. Europe can be accused of lacking administrative seriousness when it comes to its targets. On investment, the Commission has put the requirement at around 37 billion euros to reach the 2030 objective. That is substantial, though it is hardly absurd in the context of Europe's energy bill, industrial policy budgets, and the cost of recurring import shocks. The industry says tens of billions in private investment have already been identified. That is encouraging. Still, money alone does not solve a grid connection bottleneck or a planning process. As for EU industrial policy, the architecture exists in fragments. RE-Power EU set the direction. The Biomethane Industrial Partnership was launched to help organise the scale-up. The Clean Industrial Deal and its state aid framework give member states more room to support clean energy, industrial decarbonisation, and domestic clean tech. The Innovation Fund remains a major pot for low-carbon technology, though recent auction structures show Europe still has a habit of being more institutionally excited by hydrogen and electrified heat than by renewable gas. France, Denmark, and Czechia have all used state-backed schemes to support biomethane production. Italy has gone after network integration, including dedicated pipeline investments. Portugal has approved support for both biomethane and renewable hydrogen. So the policy machinery is there. It just does not move at one speed, in one direction, with one level of conviction. Europe still governs this sector like a committee trying to assemble a tractor from 4 different manuals. That takes us to the question of whether some industrial off-takers are drifting away from green hydrogen and toward biomethane. Broadly speaking, that logic is entirely believable. Biomethane can often use existing gas infrastructure, existing combustion systems, existing industrial logic, and existing carbon accounting pathways more easily than hydrogen can. Hydrogen often asks the off-taker to accept higher fuel cost, more equipment change, more process risk, and more policy uncertainty. Biomethane, by contrast, can qualify for decarbonisation value while asking for less commercial trauma. Money tends to have a strong preference for lower trauma. That does not mean hydrogen is finished. Far from it. Hydrogen still matters for ammonia, refining, some chemicals, and deeper industrial transformation where methane substitution is not enough. But in a market where grants, carbon savings, bankability and execution, risk all matter now, biomethane frequently looks like the easier first signature. Ministers can debate the molecule of the future. Off-takers usually buy the molecule that works now to lower CO2 emissions while preserving their bottom line. Now, to technology. Are there breakthrough technologies coming through, or is biogas mostly a mature sector? The answer is that the core platform is mature, and the innovation is happening around efficiency, upgrading, feedstock flexibility, carbon value, and end-use optimization. Europe is not waiting for a magic lab event here. Anaerobic digestion is established. Gas upgrading is established. Half of Europe's biomethane plants now use membrane separation, while water scrubbing and pressure swing adsorption remain common upgrading routes. That is just modern industrial engineering in progress. The more interesting frontier sits in the add-ons and second-generation pathways. Bio-LNG is scaling fast, which matters for trucking and shipping. Bio-CO2 capture is becoming economically relevant, especially where Europe wants e-fuels, negative emissions, or food-grade carbon dioxide. Gasification of woody residues and other dry biomass is another frontier, especially for industries that need on-site fossil gas substitution. There are also emerging efforts around e-methane, where captured biogenic CO2 is combined with renewable hydrogen to increase methane output, and around retrofits that squeeze more value from existing biogas plant effluents and process streams. That is where the next wave gets interesting. Europe has real technical depth here. Swedish clean tech firms are pushing modular gasification for industrial applications. Dutch and French players are active in upgrading and bio-LNG. EU-funded projects are working on retrofitting existing plants, improving methanation systems, and building better market frameworks. So yes, there are technology leaders. Still, the more important truth is that biomethane does not need a heroic breakthrough to grow. It needs better project economics, faster permitting, cleaner sustainability rules, lower leakage, and clearer demand pull. The science is useful. The bottleneck is governance. Truth is that biogas carries constraints that its more enthusiastic lobbyists sometimes glide past. Feedstock is finite. Sustainability is not automatic. Europe needs far more emphasis on wastes and residues rather than dedicated energy crops that create land use pressure or muddier carbon outcomes. Methane leakage must be measured and cut hard, otherwise the whole climate case gets bruised very quickly. Grid connection can be expensive. Small plants can struggle with upgrading economics. Cross-border certificate systems remain messy. And if policymakers chop and change support regimes, developers price in that risk, which means higher costs and slower build-out. Whilst molecule may be renewable, bureaucracy tends to remain fossilized. There is also a strategic allocation question. Europe is electrifying more of its economy. Good. It should. That means biomethane's best role is not to defend every cubic metre of legacy gas demand. Its best role is to sit alongside electrification and cover the bits where electricity still struggles on cost, speed, flexibility, or process heat. The most effective energy system Europe can build is one where clean power does the growing share of the work and domestic renewable gas handles the stubborn edges. That is a stronger system than trying to force every problem through a single technology pipe. So, where does the GreenWave land after this discussion of pros and cons? Biogas and biomethane are realistic options for Europe's energy security push, though only if we describe the role correctly. They are credible complements to electrification. They are useful partial substitutes for imported natural gas. They are immediate decarbonisation tools in sectors that cannot wait for perfect solutions. They are bankable in the right policy framework. They are also resource-constrained and incapable of carrying the whole gas system on their backs. Europe can build this sector to the point where it genuinely moves the dial on import dependence, industrial fuel switching, transport decarbonisation, and heating flexibility by 2030. But the truth staring down every European country, sweating out the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and every Trump social media bombast is that Europe cannot build its way out of gas exposure on biomethane alone. That is the tension. Europe needs more domestic electricity and more domestic molecules. It needs grids, storage, transmission, flexible power, efficiency, and cleaner gas. It needs to stop treating these as rival tribes. Every gas shock should be pushing the continent toward a tougher industrial logic. Build what reduces import exposure, promote the molecules that use local residues and works with real off-takers, and build what survives subsidy drift before the next crisis writes the policy memo for us. Because the market is already giving the answer in plain language. When imported gas gets expensive, domestic renewable gas looks smarter. When policy is stable, projects move. When policy wobbles, capital stalls. Europe has had enough evidence by now across multiple sustainable sectors. The question is whether it wants another emergency LNG bill first, just to refresh its memory. Well, that's a wrap on our 65th GreenWave podcast episode. Your generous time with us keeps this podcast going. We're easy to find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please follow us, share the episode with a friend most engaged in our sustainable issues, and leave a 5-star review. You can also keep up with us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, and at synergy-international.net. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability